This is a question from a YouTube user called The Deck Whale, capitalised, who asks, what does it actually mean for a week to be gridded for something? I've heard it a few times on a couple different pods, and I'm at total loss about what it actually is. What is it, Anoosh?
I am so glad that this question was asked, because when I was writing a piece about the Bibby Stockholm a couple of weeks ago, I found myself writing the sentence, it's Small Boats Week, and then deleting that sentence thinking this means absolutely nothing to any ordinary reader. And that's because, the government has a grid, which basically means that it plans week by week what the topics are that it's going to go big on, hoping that the media and the general public will just follow suit and go along with their announcements. Some of these announcements tend to only last for the week that they're gridded for, and then they disappear into nothingness. This was a form of communication that was established by Alistair Campbell when he was Tony Blair's spin doctor, and it's been something that has been stuck to more or less ever since. I think it was less so during the Boris Johnson years.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable we even talk about it, to be honest, because you think a big organisation like a government would have some form of media strategy. It's not exactly the most Machiavellian way of controlling the media, saying we're going to try and focus on something this week. And I also think it's to do with coordination between departments. So the grid gets sent out to all the departments, and it basically has the key focus for the day to ensure that certain departments don't speak over another department, which ministers get very upset about if they do. What do you think, Rachel?
As a concept, you're the government. It should probably be a good thing if various departments know what other departments are saying. That seems pretty basic. I don't know, I imagine it as like really complex spreadsheets on multiple screens. Do you remember when Dominic Cummings talked about having like a control centre at the heart of Downing Street? And it's not that, it's a spreadsheet. And they work in sort of 2-week blocks trying to plan out what the policy announcements are. I believe there's quite a lot of sometimes rivalry between ministers in getting your announcement in a grid and like something being bumped because of something else. And it was devised, like, it's not just about departments, but also about what else is going on. So if you've got, I don't know, the World Cup final on the line letters, you probably don't want to have be announcing a big government policy on that day. One of my favourite grid stories is in I think 2015, Steve Hilton was working for Cameron, lost the grid or lost control of the grid, and there were reports that there were all these announcements coming out, and he didn't know about them, and other departments didn't know about them. And not only did they not know that the announcement was happening, they didn't know that the policy was happening, and it turned out that he just had decided not to turn up to grid meetings and therefore didn't know what was going on. So it's one of those things where I think...
Who grids the grid?
Literally that, how if there's like a big meeting and no one's taking notes, the person who takes the minutes is actually in control because they get to say what happened in the meeting, regardless of what it actually was. I think the people who go to the grid meetings probably have a lot of unseen power. Freddie, it's often spoken about as if it's this kind of Machiavellian thing, kind of top down, we tell the BBC what to say. Is there a sort of element to this where it's quite artificial, but as journalists we kind of, follow along?
In one way it is artificial because they just choose a week to talk about a topic, but in another way they often include lots of policy announcements, and that is what the news is. I mean, remember Labour's Crime Week? I think there were 2 weeks when they did Crime Week back in April. I can't remember.
They've had so many crime weeks.
They have indeed.
Every week is Crime Week in Britain.
Just before the local elections, I think it was. But they did have policy announcements. Okay, so that's the news, and that's why we talk about it. The funny thing is, though, when you just get re-announcements of previous policies that have already been announced, or a reallocation of funding, or a new statistic, as if that's the news. So, I do think it's not necessarily very good for journalism, and it's important and also very noticeable when people don't, or when they do just follow what the government is saying. It's very tedious.
But it can have real impacts as well. But you were talking about Small Boats Week, which was the second week of the summer recess, and the government decided to go really hard on channel crossings and illegal migration. And obviously they had the Bibby Stockholm barge, and they wanted to get migrants loaded onto it that week because it was Small Boats Week, and that was kind of the centrepiece of it.
Even though they weren't from the small boats, but
even though they weren't from the small boats, but it was kind of a symbolic. It's a very large boat, in fact, they were getting onto, and obviously we know what happened with that. They put people on without having got the tests back for Legionella bacteria, and you sort of wonder if they hadn't had that artificial deadline set by the comms grid, would they have waited another week to actually get the results and not had that? I mean, there are a lot of reasons why that went wrong, and there's a lot of dysfunction in the Home Office and people not talking to each other and ministers not talking to each other and civil servants. And I'm not saying the grid was the reason the migrants had to be moved off that barge, but it is an example of you try and lead with your communications strategy, and sometimes the policy doesn't quite match up with that and it causes you headaches.
Yeah, we've had one way of looking at the grid is just a symptom of short-term government thinking. Why is Rishi Sunak spending 2 weeks of the summer, which he would have approved, focusing on small boats crisis, which he's doing extremely poorly on, the NHS, which he's doing extremely poorly on, and both of which people care about? Why is he not just focusing on the long term, focusing on those priorities? It baffles me that they volunteered a week of scrutiny on something that people really care about and they're doing poorly on.
Well, that's why I think the grid is really useful for us to know what the government wants us to be talking about, because that was, on the face of it, baffling. Why are you drawing attention to these policy areas where you're manifestly failing on? That matter to people, like you say. And so it's instructive to know that actually they're comfortable with that. Why is that? Is it because, and I get this impression from some of the people that I speak to, is it because just looking like you're trying to do something and prioritising something, is it because that's deemed enough in the public's sort of imagination? And I think that there's some people who are clinging to that idea of let's look like we're getting something done. We might not meet the inflation target, but let's go out and tell people how hard we're working on it. And that is sort of enough for people to think, okay, by the next election, they've made some progress on these targets. Let's not risk everything with Labour that could ruin everything, and let them carry on, in their slow plod towards progress. I think that's going to be part of the calculation that they make in the next election. Don't let Labour mess it up.
So I think there's definitely some thinking on those lines. I wrote the politics column in the New Statesman magazine this week, on illegal migration and stop the boats, and why, as a slogan, what it was meant to do and how it is backfiring. And I think there very much was a sense when Rishi Sunak chose that as a priority in January of looking in control of this problem. The other four were things that kind of affect everyone, like living standards, NHS waiting lists, economic stability. That was very much a kind of red meat to the Tory base. What's interesting is it's not working. 80% of Conservative voters don't trust the government to take control of illegal immigration, and more Conservative voters think Suella Braverman is doing badly than think she's doing well. That's not like voters as a whole, that's Conservatives. So I think it has backfired in that they've drawn a lot of attention to an issue that their base really, really care about without having the results to back it up. But I guess they think that just talking about it might be enough, even though the polls don't bear that out.
Yeah, I mean, does intention have any value than just delivery? I do think sometimes people do appreciate politicians' intentions more than we give them credit for.
But after 13 years and after years and years of promises on migration, I'm not sure they have much credibility to stand on.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.